This is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
And this is Father Patrick Briscoe.
And welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoyed the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you find your podcasts. Father Patrick, it is mid-September, and there's something quite exciting coming up, which our viewers might know or listeners might know about. But what are you excited about soon?
I certainly hope that they know about it, but it's all that I'm sleeping, eating, living, and breathing at the moment. It's the Dominican Rosary Pilgrimage, which is going to be a fabulous event. I'm really thrilled about it because, of course, for everyone who knows us and knows the Dominicans, they know that the Rosary is an important part of our charism. It's an important part of our life. From the daily recitation of the Rosary that takes place in our houses, or the rosaries we wear on our habits, or hopefully the preaching of Dominicans on the Rosary. People associate the Dominican order with the Rosary, this devotion which the Church has entrusted to us. And we've got this new way of spreading it, which I hope will be an annual event to take place just before the month of the Rosary every year.
That's right. Well, Dominicans, and we are associated with the Rosary, particularly if people have seen many things, Our Lady of the Rosary. Of course, celebrate this moving up to this feast in October. And then also rosaries, I think, if I get this right, before Vatican II or somewhere around there, could only be blessed by Dominicans for somewhere else. We have a special prayer. So this is I'm making this dangerous for Dominicans because you can stop a Dominican, ask for the Dominican rosary blessing. He may or may not know it. Usually it's in a little book. Some of us know it, some of us don't. But it's a beautiful short, there's a short form of it. It's a long form too. But the short form of the Dominican blessing of the rosary. So yeah, it's something that we care deeply about. We're supposed to preach about. And it's not something, we hear a lot of preaching on. I suppose we're in the year of the Eucharist, but perhaps an upcoming year might be year of the rosary or something.
Maybe. We'll see what the Holy Father decides. I mean, certainly for us, one thing that we noticed was with the change of the abortion debate in our country after Dobbs, there was a move back to the states to emphasize things on the local level. And one thing that we saw living here in Washington was how that impacted the National March for Life, which takes place and will continue to take place every January. It seemed like that had become the kind of de facto national Catholic gathering. Yeah. And so we wanted to do something. We wanted to put something together on a large scale at the heart of the Church. So this pilgrimage is being held at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, right? America's Catholic Church. Yeah. The shrine dedicated to Our Lady right here in our neighborhood in Brookland in Northeast DC. So we wanted to pick something and establish an event that was at a place that people would know, a place easy enough to get to, but that would resonate with this desire to bring Catholics together around especially our need for spiritual renewal in the country. So that's the shtick in a short bit. Yeah,
and that's fine. And people want to look up, they can look at DominicanRosaryPilgrimage.org or just type in Dominican Rosary Pilgrimage. Now, almost no one knows websites anymore. I think it's like phone numbers. No one knows phone numbers, except for that first time you send on a text. So in the same way, just type in Dominican Rosary Pilgrimage and you'll find us. They'll be linked down in the show notes and other things like that. But our discussion is not, as people know from reading the subject line, DominicanRosaryPilgrimage.org, but rather the questions about how to deal with transgender ideology. And this is something that, is perennial, not hopefully as perennial as the Rosary is, but it seems to be something that we're always talking about and we're still struggling to make sense of in this country. And so we thought in this episode we'd offer some reflections on transgender ideology and how to deal with it, and both on the personal and the political level, all this. There's lots to say. Neither of us are particular experts on all the fields, but that's never going to stop a Dominican from pontificating or bringing in good accounts of virtue and vice and truth. So let's start off with transgender ideology. We talk about transgender, but what about transgender ideology? What's the difference here between transgender and, say, transgender ideology?
Right. I think the place to begin is actually, even though we're talking about ideas, we're talking about people.
That's a good point.
So coming out of my life as a priest, this is impacting souls all around us, and in some cases it's destroying the lives of our children. So this is not something that is just a merely academic discussion. It's not just an idea that can be debated like German pietist idealism.
Sure.
Which might actually in the end be right about a lot of things.
And impacts lives.
But we're talking about something that is being experienced broadly, that's a cultural trend that's all around us. So I had an extremely destabilizing encounter a few months ago where I ran into someone who I hadn't seen for a while, someone that I knew well, someone that is an extremely devout Catholic. I asked him how his son was doing, and he said, well, actually, we just sent her off to college, and she goes by name now, which is not his son's name, and shows me a picture of this child. And it was extremely destabilizing. It just caught me completely off guard. And I, who am not usually one for words, I have many words to say about many things, not all of them edifying, but I was just stuck. I hardly knew what to say, even to engage the conversation. So I think it's important that we begin right, and that our listeners hear us saying we're talking about something that is a deeply pastoral issue that is affecting people all around us, and we're not coming at this conversation by any means with any distance. This is immediately touching people in our lives.
I think it seems hard to believe that anyone living in a city or around more than 1,000 people has not experienced this, even amongst their friends or something. And when you say this is, I think it's important we're looking at what is this phenomena, what we're talking about. And I think you're right to divide between the personal, the kind of pastoral the experience, but then the kind of political aspect. And we've done episodes on, we talked to Brandon Voigt about transgender and some things about dealing with apologetics and how to deal with things. In this one, it seems like taking a step back a minute and talking about it from a larger framework, and I think that's the ideological component, that ideology. So transgender, of course, people probably know is the sense of gender as separate from sex or in some relation to sex, gender as an expression of someone's masculinity or femininity, man or woman versus male and female as the sex. These terms, well, they're tricky, but we can all agree that there is a difference between woman and female, since we don't think of female lizards as women, and yet we might not be inclined to separate them as much. That's where this separation comes in with the ideological component, I'd say. And just briefly, for those who hear ideology need not be necessarily a bad thing. It's just a construct about how to understand reality of things. But the worry about ideology is when ideology, or the conceptual framework, how we interpret the world, becomes so separate from the world itself. The best ideologies or best conceptions and constructions of the world are to bring out what's actually there. So we could talk about a Thomistic ideology in the sense of action potency, but that's dealing with what's there. The idea is it brings out more of what's there. The concern about ideologies when they get dangerous is when they actually hide what's really there. And that's my concern, at least, with transgender ideology is, are you imposing something conceptual that's not actually there, or are you bringing out something that is there that we didn't see before?
Right, that's absolutely right. So this phrase, transgender ideology, has already made it to the list of phrases we're not allowed to say anymore.
Oh, so this episode has been canceled.
Yeah, exactly. So this spring, the Associated Press ruled in its recent update to the Style book that newspapers following AP Style are not to say transgender ideology. Instead, they're to talk about transgender persons or trans people, making it clear that this is not just not just a framework. So it's a complete rejection of what Father Bonaventure just said, and an insistence by the Associated Press that this is not allowed. Well, but of course this is wrong. This is in fact a philosophy. Transgender ideology is a philosophy, a kind of knowing, an expression of the universe around us. So it's important for us to respond knowing that there's a philosophical claim being made, knowing that these terms carry weight, and knowing that the terms are contentious and that it's okay to debate them in the public square. So transgender and ideology contain, as what Father Bonaventure was saying, an imposition actually on one's interpretation of reality.
Yeah, and it is so strange to me to think of this. It's an Orwellian vision of newspeak where we actually say, hey, you're not allowed to call this an ideology, what have you, because it's imposing its own framework, an ideology of speech that we get to cancel and get to say what things are, which just drives shivers through my veins, I suppose, or that makes me crazy. But so we're going to keep calling it transgender ideology because I think it is helpful to realize that it is basically, since yesterday, since everyone would have thought this and that's an ideology, and that you actually have to force the language such that you don't because it is a strange conception of reality. It is a strange conception that you would have no necessary relationship to your body on this. But we've got to deal with this, both the AP Press and with people that we meet. So let's dig in a little bit on it and talk about, well, how are we as good Catholics to deal with this, and how can we address it? I think one of the brilliant parts about Thomism in general, and the gift we have, is trying to bring out the best arguments or what's true in every position, because Dominicans believe that people aren't evil entirely, or crazy entirely, or stupid entirely, but that if someone believes something firmly, there must be some kind of grasp of reality, something tag on there. But put it said this way, ideology can't float entirely freely from reality. It's got to have some relation. And we've always thought there's this kind of phrase, sandad, which is used for Dominican kind of things. And I've always found it helpful in situations of controversy, where you say, sometimes affirm, never deny, always distinguish. And that's the kind of move on this. So maybe we could talk through, when someone's addressing this issue, first how to think about it, and then how to encounter it in personal and political realms through this lens.
I think that's fantastic. So what should be the starting place? What would I want to affirm right away? Well, I want to affirm that people are not comfortable in their bodies. Mm-hmm. We see this 1,000 ways, right? This is part of what Instagram preys on us about thinking, the deep insecurities we have about our appearance. Young people, when you're growing, there are many changes that are happening to your body that are biological, that can be extremely unsettling. So I think those are true. Mm-hmm. That people can and do feel radically uncomfortable even in their own skin, and that growing up is difficult because of changes that one is experiencing in one's own body. Okay, yeah. So I think those are true, and I think that the distress that children can sometimes feel is a real thing. Mm-hmm. Now, what that means, however, is a point where I have a lot of questions. One source that I love, this is from Teresa Farnan's excellent deep dive into transgender ideology in a recent issue of our Sunday Visitor.
It's who's the editor online. Of that?
It's a fabulous publication. I would absolutely recommend it.
Okay.
But she uses as one of her source Dr. Robert Garofalo, who's the director of the Gender Development Program at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. So an extremely accomplished physician who acknowledges that there's no form, no scale, no psychological battery of tests that needs to be done to diagnose a child as transgender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I think a lot of people, when they enter into this debate, they have a compassion for a child, especially who is uncomfortable in his or her own skin, who recognizes some changes that he or she is going through that are difficult to account, and they say, oh, this child is diagnosed as transgender, and that means that there's some kind of recognition that there's an experience of dysmorphia there. However, there's no scientific method for actually proving that.
Yes.
There's none.
Yeah, this is the one where we've said for a while, this is a cliche, but trust the science, this sort of trust the experts. But again, with an ideology, or when you wonder if an ideology is becoming a little too crazy or a little too ideological, an ideological ideology is when it stops discourse, and then it also doesn't show any credentials. So the sense of, we do believe we're rooted in reality, there should be empirical tests to things like this. Even psychical phenomena should have structures to them. So,
yes.
So in the psychological realm, you should be able to, there are psychical laws that this is what, for in its best part, psychology studies. And so there should be, even with these kind of things, even as related to the body, there should be some standard measure that can say they have these kind of thoughts in this way. And you could, maybe there would be an example of that, but if you just say, no, whatever they claim is right, whatever you claim, if it's a real phenomena, it's going to be structured. Whether it's structured physically, empirically, or psychically, it'll have some structure because the world is ordered and organized in some fashion. I was thinking about the comment about people being uncomfortable in their bodies, and the very first line of, what is it? Porphyry's biography of Plotinus, the 200s.
Yes.
He says, never was anyone so uncomfortable in his body as Plotinus. And yet it would have never occurred to any ancient Greek or Plotinus that perhaps Plotinus was a woman. That there is at some point a difference, a relationship between our bodies, even there, recognizing wise. So that's something that we can appreciate and understand in this, but then need not, at least it didn't for 1800 years, make this possible, this sort of the transgender idea. The other thing I think is when we think of never denying, of something that's grasping on this, is it is true that masculinity is not just maleness, that there is a difference between a biological foundation and a psychical development and a socio-cultural phenomenon. That these are not the same things, right? It's very important that as humans, we're not just animals. Like, we're rational animals, which means we exist in a psychical and a social and a cultural milieu that we bring about concepts and all this. So that we're not just basic biological animals, and that therefore we should get rid of the notion of man and woman and just stick to male and female. It's interesting that on the other side, you might think, if that was the case, if we were just biology, and if those who are traditionalists like ourselves, or I don't know, let's say humans like ourselves, you would just say, well, we're just going to stick with male and female. That's easier to do this, but it doesn't work because there are degrees of masculinity. It does describe a real phenomenon. The concern, I suppose, for us is to say that that development, masculinity and femininity, manhood and womanhood, should be a development out of the base of something, not in deep conflict with something. And my concern with the ideological component is an ideology that's, when it starts separating from reality, can say things like, it looks this way, but it's actually the opposite. And that's when you should, if something is so disparate from reality and what they're saying, then you might say, I wonder if this isn't just an ideology and not actually an account of reality. And so the man and woman are different than male and female, but they should have at least in my mind, because we are rational animals that are developed animals. We're no longer animals, but we're animals in the best sense. In a sense, masculinity should be maleness in a developed, rational sense, and should be related to us. And I think we're so used to a modern scientific skepticism, where if I look at that, don't worry, I don't know if I can trust my senses, this sort of thing, that maybe everything's totally different. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat. Maybe it's all simulation. This stuff is, it's ideologically crazy, but I think we have this natural sense that we give it more hearing than we ought.
Right. I certainly agree with that. I mean, part of what's being contested, is exactly what you're pointing to, is our encounter with reality. I mean, and for a Christian, there's a deeply, deeply problematic philosophy to deal with, because for a Christian, the created world is received. Mm-hmm. It's made by a creator who intended it by design to be a certain way, which poses extremely difficult questions about God's intentionality if he would make a frustrated being like this. Yeah. That is a complicated philosophical question that's not being asked by people who are proposing this vision of reality who are Christians. Christians believe that reality is received. I am not a creature of my own making. I was made by God. I was made this way by God. I was given this body, this soul by God, and all of that, it reflects God's intentionality and God's design. And that is a sticking point that is not being addressed in this debate. So I think what we need to do is we need to not pass over those fundamental aspects of Catholic human anthropology. Yeah, because we have a philosophical understanding of who we are that can counter and can engage this. And so our work then is to begin to develop it. And we're beginning to see this from our bishops, thank God. So they've written some extremely helpful things. There was an instruction, for example, that was passed by the U.S. Bishops' Doctrine Committee on it was a pastoral work on transgenderism that had a number of important points. One of which was the limits of medical transition. What kinds of interventions can be done on a person experiencing gender dysphoria? And these bioethical issues are at the forefront of this debate because what is being contended is that we now have the technology to refashion ourselves according to our own designs or according to our own making, right? Which means, I don't like my body the way that it is. I'll just go to a hospital and charge $1 bazillion to my insurance company and become a lifetime medical patient so that I can have some kind of new modern scientific intervention in my body. I think we should be talking about that.
Yes. Again, the ideological component to this, and maybe I feel like we're striking hard on the ideology component, maybe even though it's the AP Press is and we should say, hey, you can't, this is the best way to describe it, this ideological component. Again, there are people's experiences, psychological trauma, psychological experiences, all of that, but then it's the encoding of the language around this and what it is, the kind of telling top down by people usually in political realms, what this is, that encodes a particular way we're supposed to talk about. And really what's important about it is that it's against a Christian account of reality. And I think this is why this is not going to go away. And it's also something that we ought to be attentive to and take seriously. I think sometimes on the personal, let me divide this way. On the personal level, compassion and listening to people is always necessary. Like when you're dealing with a person, one-to-one, you have to treat them as a person. And the trick with transgender ideology is sometimes we can take the same way we respond to persons and treat that as the way we ought to respond to societies, sort of institutions. But institutions aren't persons. I mean, maybe legally and fictionally, they're fictional persons, but they're not real persons that have feelings and have to be treated and have weaknesses and have sufferings and all of this. Institutions don't do that sort of thing. Institutions need to be set up for the persons. But institutions themselves need to be looked at with an objective, hard, real talk kind of lens. And my concern with transgender ideology is no matter how pastoral we ought to treat people, and we ought to treat people, we ought not to extend that kind of treatment to institutions. So our political regime and this language, whether it be from newspapers or from politicals, that's the whole point of the American Project, is we get to fight in public about how we see society. We'll be pastoral and sensitive and compassionate to each other as we ought. But in the political realm, people might not like a little bit of fighting, but this is the American Project is founded upon. And this is an issue that, because it strikes against the core notions of Christian reality, if we give up on this one here, we're going to give up on a lot down the road.
There is no element of this debate that is benign.
Yeah, that's right.
I think someone that I would point to as a great example, who is hosting this dialogue well, who is doing this brilliantly in the public square, it's Archbishop Coakley out in Oklahoma City.
Yeah,
absolutely fantastic job. I mean, they've part of that is driven by their state's politics, his state's politics. There's a certain drive amongst Oklahomans, right, to be among those states that have outlawed medical interventions for children. I think there are 16 states now that have made that rightly illegal. So he's been very active in the political sphere. But then when he wrote about this issue to Catholics in his diocese, he took a tone that was extremely compassionate, extremely pastoral, offering lots of practical advice, especially for parents who are the ones really who are facing this question because of what their kids are going through. So, for example, some of the tips that he gave are that we can never surrender the use of someone's proper pronouns, meaning the pronouns that are proper to that person's sex. We can't surrender that or engage that. He suggests, however, that for a period of time, especially in family life, it might be beneficial to use a name or a nickname that can ease tension and keep pathways open for dialogue. So I completely agree that something like that could be very helpful. Another point that he emphasizes is that parents cannot make this question or this aspect of what their child is experiencing the only thing they talk about. So what you're suggesting here is that there's a different element to how we react to people with whom we have deep relationships. Yeah. As opposed to how it is that we react on issues in the public square, and that's a completely legitimate thing, and mandates calls from us for two different responses.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to demarcate this and to have courage in a sense. If I had so you've given some practical advice about the pronouns use, which is very difficult and tricky, but we care about being truthful with our speech, and so it's one of those. matters where it's not worth compromising on that. Although there's no reason to make someone unnecessarily uncomfortable. So if, again, as you say, if they have a different name or something, then that might be perfectly acceptable. But naming reality, that's a different matter. So the personal approach and realizing that this needs, care and compassion and all of that, deep relationships, is different than how we ought to deal with this in the public square. I would say that I've been thinking more about the need for courage on this issue.
That clarity.
And clarity, yeah. And I think in perhaps a sustained front, and that, when I spoke about the ideology part is, if you remember or if you keep the ideology focus to this, and I think it is an ideology, and I think you can point out reasons why that is the case, then ideologies are something we can be against in public spheres. I think about in the 1950s, oh dear, I'm going to go back to Marxism. We as Americans were, if you watch, it's amazing to watch Life is Worth Living and Archbishop Sheen, and there's just always communism. Communism is always the Marxist ideology and all this kind of stuff. Now, I'm not saying that we should have a campaign and Star Wars program and a Reaganite move against transgender in that way. All I'm saying is that as a public, we were okay with calling ideologies for what they were, even though you might have known a communist and a socialist sympathizer or something. Perhaps I'd say something similar in the transgender thing is that we've been, I think as Christians, we get bullied sometimes into worried about what we'll look like to people and that we ought to be nice. But if you read the accounts of the martyrs and you read the accounts of the early church, when a state was trying to impose something that was actually harmful and against the true worship of God, as you talk about the notion God as creator and all of this is tied up in transgender accounts of what the world is and how God is and who God is in terms of him making mistakes and this kind of stuff. We ought to take that seriously and realize that transgender ideology and transgender discussion is not just a social matter, but it's a deeply religious matter. It's a matter about who we are as Christians, and therefore, if we're on the right side of it, as I deem we are, we should be courageous to speak up and not going out and attacking, but when someone brings it up, say, this is actually a really important issue, and I don't just feel strongly and sense of personally passionate about it, but I have intellectual commitments and faith commitments that mean that this is against those, and I'm very concerned about this. And to feel confident that actually, at the end of the day, we will win, although it's not clear at all how that's going to work.
This attack on sexual difference undermines our most fundamental institutions we've been talking about, our belief in God, but also our understanding of the family. And I think that we should not be shy about how this ideology aims to destroy our children's relationships to their parents, to the role that a child's mother and a child's father have to play in that child's life, in the mother and the father's desire to bring the child up as a fundamentally religious person, because this ideology rejects religion in most instances, and understands Christianity as the kind of thing opposed to it. So part of what it does is it inherently places itself at odds with a parent's desire to raise their children in a religious setting, and then again, because of the rejection of or the compromised understanding of sexual difference, fundamentally undermines the family as such. We've got a huge problem on our hands that is beyond just a kind of reimagining of a social construct. This is a radically different claim about who we are, how we were made, and what we were for. Yeah, that's what ideologies, they're universal, and therefore they strike at everything. Because once they separate from reality, you can't keep them from getting in and changing everything around it. They're not isolated. So that's we have to pray about it too. And we started with the prayer, the Dominican Rosary pilgrimage, and I think Mary interceding with asking for her intercession on this is also important. But that's where we'll have to leave it for now. There's plenty of more conversations about this. So thanks for those listening to this episode of Godsplaining. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Like, subscribe, leave a 5-star review. Share this episode if people are wondering about transgender ideology and trying to figure out. We're all trying to sort this out. This is, again, the destabilizing position we're in, but with care, compassion, with prayer and love. So if you enjoy this podcast, please donate. Donate to us on Patreon. Follow the link in the description for that. You can follow us
Also, the link to find, you can follow the link also in the description for information on merchandise, upcoming events. I want to mention just two. First off, the Rosary Pilgrimage that's happening in just a little bit over a week, so September 30th at the National Shrine. So please look on the website for that. If you're around the area, please join for it. Hear some Dominican preaching, meet some Dominicans there. We're always love to see you in person. Also, we have the Young Adults Retreat, which is not on transgender, but on relativism and the Catholic faith, although these are connected. So if you want to come on November 3rd through 5th at Malvern, we'd love to have you there. Look on the website of Godsplaining for how to sign up and to submit requests for that, and look on for more information. We'd love to have you there. November 3rd through the 5th in Malvern, Pennsylvania. For us here, though, that's it. If you pray for us, we promise we'll be praying for you, and we'll catch you next time on Godsplaining.